Can I get the screen down? Thank you. Good morning. Happy early Mother's Day. It's next week, right? And then a month from that, we celebrate Father's Day. So it's like 2 days out of the year, we get to tell Mom and Dad, thank you, in spite of the fact that you screwed us up. Now I'm sort of joking and sort of not. One of my favorite teachers, James Hillman, several years ago wrote a book titled, "We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and things are getting worse." Now, a lot of therapists don't like that. Hillman was an antagonist, so he sort of liked to stir things up. But part of the reason Hillman suggested that things are getting worse for a lot of us in therapy is that our story is too small. That he said in this sort of post-Freudian culture, when we go to therapy, or even when we go on a date, we spend most of our time talking about the people who made us who we are, which is Mom and Dad. So he suggests that this sort of reductionist view of parenting, this idea in the modern or postmodern world especially that our mom and dad are pretty much solely responsible for the way we turned out, he says has made therapy unsuccessful. Now, we want to enlarge on this a little bit. In his book, best-selling book back in the late 90s, The Soul's Code, he has a chapter or a section in there called Parental Fallacy. The parental fallacy. And in that book, there's a quote that says, in our modern world, cosmic parents, like the gods, nature, animals, and ancestors, are replaced solely by personal mothers and fathers who are divinized, causing effects of cosmic proportions. You understand what he's saying there? He's suggesting that in the ancient world, there was more to parenting than just mom and dad. That the ancients had a bigger paradigm, that the story called your life or the tribal life or the life of the group, whatever, was a story authored not only by mom and dad and the little nuclear family, but that the parenting was done by the entire cosmos. That the cosmos itself was the anima mundi, or the living world, the world infused or suffused with soul. So that everything from the animals in the world, and those of you that have pets know that your pets parent you. If we had a little Pomeranian here today, I would have her up here and illustrate how little Mindy has parented and is parenting me. So the animals parent us. Nature and geography parents us, where we're born, whether we're raised in the city or in the country, etc. And the gods, the involvement of the archetypal presences, the invisibles, if you will, the spirits that work on us, also parent us, Hillman suggests. And the part we're going to focus on today is the ancestral part. I just finished teaching a class on African religion, African mythology, and in there we looked at the idea that the common denominators on the continent of Africa in traditional African religions have to do with the notion that the universe comes from the one high God. That this God is sort of so far removed that it contacts us through these aspects of itself as animal aspects, nature aspects, gods that are sort of living presences, and ancestor aspects. So the parenting process, according to the ancients, and this is what Hillman is sort of picking up on and sort of reminding us or trying to bring us back to this possibility, the parenting is done by a much bigger group of authors. That you are authored by the place you were raised as much as you were by dad and mom. That you were authored by your interaction with not only animals that we generally look at, but the very microbes that are in your gut. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. And that we are authored by ancestors. And that's what I want to focus on this morning, is the ancestral role in parenting. Just go here. Carl Jung, Hillman's instructor, and in a way a parent to James Hillman, Jung says this in his autobiography. He said, in the winter of 1955-56, I chiseled the names of my paternal ancestors on the 3 stone tablets and placed them in the courtyard of the tower. Jung built this place on a lake that was his little retreat center, and he had a tower there where it was a sort of monument, and he chiseled the names himself. He did all of the work himself. He chiseled the names of certain ancestors there. I painted the ceiling with motifs from my own wife's coat of arms and from those of my sons-in-law. Remember those coat of arms things? How many of you have done some research into coats of arms? Not very popular these days. He said, when I was working on the stone tablets, I became aware of the fateful links between me and my ancestors. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. You see how suddenly the story has taken on a bigger perspective? That he's looking at his life story not just as Jung's story with mom and dad, but he's looking at his story as a story that includes mom and dad are parts of bigger stories that are part of a bigger story that's part of an ancestral story, and that therapy itself is bringing the ancestors to bear on the story. He said, it often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family, which is passed on from parents to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. Now, isn't that interesting? What Jung is suggesting here is that your life is more like a Tolkien story or a J.K. Rowling story, and that you are a chapter or maybe a paragraph in a chapter. But there are a whole lot of paragraphs and chapters that went before through the ancestral lineage, and there are a whole lot more coming. So when we come to therapy, we're not just coming in to sort of gaze at the parental navel, saying, well, if my dad hadn't, if my mom hadn't, then I would. So you see what's being said here? It's much, much bigger. Now, the part I want to focus on today is some mind-blowing, for me anyway, mind-blowing stuff that suggests that this notion of ancestral parenting or ancestral presences is actually starting to come to the fore in modern science. Some of you have seen this. Some of you may not. How many of you know have heard of superorganisms? Have you heard of that? It's not very well known. The term first came into being a few decades ago when they started noticing that if you took an ant out of the ant colony and you placed it out somewhere a long way from the colony, what would happen to the ant? It would die. Same thing with bees and many other insects and bacteria. If you isolate them from the larger superorganism, then they die. So this idea was originally sort of posed for insects and that sort of thing, but more recently, over the last couple of decades, this idea of superorganism is now being applied to human beings. That each of us is a sort of superorganism. Now, many of us have heard this idea that we're comprised of microbes, right? That's why you eat yogurt. Did I hear? Yes. Especially, say it again? Probiotic. Because probiotic means it's pro-life. The little living organisms inside of us actually want to be fed. Because if they're not fed properly, then you get sick. So we are all superorganisms, and we know this idea of the microbes, but now they're starting to suggest that this superorganism called the human being, called you, called me, is actually comprised not only of bacteria, but also of cells from other people. Woo, 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 woo. And here's some of the books these two books over here, The Human Superorganism, How the Microbiome is Revolutionizing the Pursuit of a Healthy Life. And then this one here, I just ordered it. Superorganism, Learning to Love Your Inner Ecosystem. Now this inner ecosystem, as I said, is more than just bacteria. There are cells. Well, let's see what the research is doing. Any of you heard of Lydia Fairchild? Probably not. Lydia Fairchild had 2 children by a man that she had been in a relationship with, and he left, and he wasn't paying child support, so she went to court to get child support. Well, the father of the children, the 2 boys, said, I want you to prove that these children belong to me, that I'm the actual father. So they did all the testing, and the results came back to the court, and they presented the results in the court, and those results said the following: yes, he is the father, but there's a problem. Anybody want to guess? You're not the mother. And Lydia Fairchild said, I was there. I am the mother. Well, the court was about to throw it out and say, you know, you're scamming us. You're trying to scam us by having children here that aren't yours. Well, her attorney just so happened, luckily, to have come across a paper written in an academic institution, medical institution, that had proved that there was another woman who was in the same situation. She had borne children that did not have any of her DNA, did not have her blood type, had nothing that connected her physically to the children that she bore. And they presented this and said, Your Honor, we have evidence that children can be born of mothers without any of their DNA in them. Ooh. Here I have it summarized. Lydia Fairchild's paternity test contained no trace of her DNA in her own children. The courts accused her of illegal surrogacy to gain benefits. Around the same time, a paper woman had the same experience. Her children had the DNA and blood type of an absorbed twin, but not of an absorbed twin in the womb of the woman who bore them. The absorbed twin was in the womb of the mother. So that when the mother was a fetus in the womb, there were twins. And they're finding that this is much more common than we once knew, that it's not uncommon for us to gestate in the womb of our mother with another baby in the first few weeks that is absorbed into the one, so that only one child is born, and yet that one child has all of the traits of the twin in the womb. So this woman had come out and had essentially given birth to her twins' children. How many of you have heard this before? Some of you? Nobody? It's wild. You're saying I'm making this up. No, there's the University of Washington. We're going to look at in a moment here at a woman scientist at the University of Washington who is at the forefront of this research. What they're discovering is that we are walking around with cells and DNA in us that did not and do not belong to our birth parents. And that some of us were very likely, in fact, highly probable, some of us were in the womb with a twin. So that we are actually little schizophrenics. I'm not making light of schizophrenia, you understand? But I am suggesting that there is much more to cellular research and genetics than meets the eye. I like to call these our modern mythical terms, and I'm not putting them down. They're very valuable, they're very important. Science is very important, genes and cells are very important. But sometimes we moderns, and I think this is true of all cultures, think that when we use terms, we know what they mean. Do you understand? That when we use the term cell, we think we know what we mean. Well, now with this research, we obviously don't know quite what we mean. That cells are more than just cells. That genetic material is more than just genetic material. That when the ancients talked about things like the book of life, or called the baby in the womb, as Psalm 139 says, a tapestry, that maybe cells would just as well be named chapters. Do you understand? These cells contain stories. We're finding that there is information. We know that about DNA. But what if the information, rather than just being this sort of set of factual details, in the DNA strand, has a narrative in them? Did you understand what I'm suggesting here? That we come into this world, each of us, with a little bit of the family narrative. It's one of the reasons one child in the family likes science and the other likes music. And you find yourself going to therapy as brothers and sisters telling completely opposite stories about what happened in the family. That happens. Every once in a while I'll talk to my brother and sister and they'll tell me something that didn't happen in our family. At least not the way I remember it. Well, what if it's because each of us is a separate story? Do you understand what I'm saying here? How does this affect therapy? How does this affect the way we look at our families? It affects it in this way, and as we saw in Jung's quote, each of us may be coming into this world carrying a part of the ancestral story. Each of us, now Carl Jung, one of the reasons he said what he said is because he was raised in the home of a father who was a minister, a pastor, Swiss Reformed minister. And Jung said as Jung was growing up, he would hear his father questioning everything he'd been taught about the Swiss Reformed theology in private, with his wife, with his children. But when he went to the pulpit, he would spout the correct doctrines. But then when he would come home, he would bitch and complain that he had to spout the correct doctrines. Jung said, I lost all respect for my father. Because my father was telling the story one way from the pulpit to keep his retirement and benefits, and another way in private to express the story of his own soul. Some of you know what I'm talking about here from various kinds of experience. And what Jung suggested was that he had been given the next chapter of the story to sort of go beyond the family tradition of saying one thing in public and another in private. So when Jung was a disciple of Sigmund Freud, in fact, heir apparent to Freud, Freud said, you're going to carry on my legacy. Jung, as a young man of about the age of 37, suddenly dawned on him that he didn't like Freud's dogma. He disagreed with Freud when it came to the matters of collective unconscious and other things that aren't important here. But he found himself in a real quandary. The very father that he had despised for his two faces, Jung said, I found myself experiencing. Because every part of my being, you have to remember back in 1913, Sigmund Freud in the world of psychology was like the rock star of psychology. And here's Jung about to inherit rock star status. And he said, I disagreed with much of what he said. And he said, then I remembered my father. What decision did Jung make? He went to Dr. Freud and he said, sir, I disagree with you. And Freud said, you can't. It's all about sex. Jung said, a lot of it's about sex, but a lot of it's about God too. And so Jung left. Now my point is this, as I wrap this up. I think it would expand our awareness of this life that we're living if we could see on Mother's Day and Father's Day that we might get Dad and Mom a card that said, thank you for passing on your piece of the story to me that I may tell the story of our larger family. They'll go, what the hell are you talking about? And you might get to sit down and talk to them about this church and invite them and say, we believe weird things over here. But you understand what I'm saying? See how it shifts the perspective of what Mom and Dad did to me? Mom and Dad did to you what had been done to them. And to me, what's more important than that is to see that what is being done to all of us is part of a larger purposeful narrative. Do you understand? The story has purpose. Your life has purpose. But like at the end of The Hobbit, how many Hobbit readers? Do we have people here, more hands on Hobbit than Superorganism? That's good. At the end of The Hobbit, when the whole adventure's over, the story's over, little Bilbo Baggins is sitting with Gandalf. And he says something like, question, I'll paraphrase it, to Gandalf, he says, how big a role do you think I played in this story? And Gandalf laughed and he said, oh, you're quite a fine little hobbit, Mr. Baggins, but you played a very, very small role in a very, very large story. Important, but not the whole story. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let's just take a moment and do a closing prayer here. Take a breath. This morning we recognize the one high God, the one, as manifesting in many other gods and goddesses, in nature, in all the archetypal patterns of nature, and in all the animal realm, and all the archetypal patterns, and all of those things that affect us. But this morning we also recognize that the one high God with many stories manifests as an ancestral story. And it's my prayer for each person in this room as you contemplate mom and dad and grandparents and family history and genealogies, and that each of us will sort of maybe reframe and see that we play a very important part, a small part, in a very large story. And maybe the next 100 years of therapy, things will get better. And so it is. Blessings on you all.
Thank you, Mike.